The whisper of instincts. The open highway stretched endlessly before Michael Watt, a recently retired Marine in his mid-30s. His truck hummed steadily along the asphalt, the countryside rolling by in a blur of greens and browns under the warm afternoon sun. Life had slowed down for Michael since his return from service, yet the tension in his shoulders betrayed the vigilance that was as much a part of him as the scars on his hands. His military days were behind him, but the instincts they had sharpened never left. Michael had been driving for hours, the solitude of the road offering a sense of peace that the bustling city could never provide. He had no specific destination in mind, just a vague longing to escape the weight of memories that often felt too heavy to bear. His journey brought him to a nondescript rest stop along a lonely stretch of highway, the Ember Field Rest Stop. The rest stop emerged like a mirage against the flat terrain, a modest building with a handful of cars scattered across the parking lot. It was the kind of place travelers passed through without a second thought, a temporary pause in the monotony of their journey. Michael pulled into the lot, the crunch of gravel under his tires breaking the serene silence of the evening. The glow of the diner's fluorescent lights spilled onto the pavement, beckoning weary travelers inside. Stepping out of his truck, Michael stretched his legs and inhaled the crisp air. The faint aroma of coffee and fried food drifted out from the diner. He wasn't hungry, but the thought of a hot cup of coffee was too inviting to resist. Adjusting his jacket, he walked toward the glass doors, pushing them open to reveal the diner's quiet interior. The atmosphere inside was subdued. A few truckers nursed their mugs of coffee, their faces lined with fatigue. An elderly couple sat in the far corner, sharing a piece of pie. The hum of fluorescent lights mingled with the clink of cutlery, creating a backdrop of mundane serenity. Michael scanned the room with practiced efficiency, his gaze moving from face to face, noting exits, potential threats, and patterns of behavior, habits ingrained from years of military service. His eyes settled on a pair near the window. A young black girl, no older than 8, and an older white man seated across from her. The man was dressed in a neatly pressed suit, his salt and pepper hair combed meticulously. He held a newspaper in one hand, glancing over it occasionally at the girl. She, in contrast, wore a bright red dress that clashed with the somber tones of her surroundings. Her curly hair framed a face that was strikingly expressive, eyes wide and darting nervously, fingers fidgeting in her lap. Michael frowned. Something about the pair didn't sit right with him. The girl's small frame seemed tense, her movements stiff and uncertain. She glanced around the diner as if searching for an escape route. Her hands rose to her face briefly, then dropped back to her lap, a repetitive motion that betrayed her unease. The man, meanwhile, maintained a calm exterior, but his gaze was sharp, too focused on the girl to be entirely casual. Michael's instincts tingled, a subtle warning that he couldn't ignore. He reminded himself not to jump to conclusions. There could be a perfectly innocent explanation for their dynamic. Maybe she was his daughter, adopted or otherwise. Maybe they were relatives. But the nervous energy radiating from the girl gnawed at him. He approached the counter and ordered a coffee, positioning himself at a vantage point near the vending machines. It gave him a clear view of the pair without drawing attention to himself. As he sipped the steaming cup, he observed them closely. The girl's fingers tapped a silent rhythm on the tabletop. Her feet swung beneath her seat, unable to touch the floor. Every so often, she'd glance at the man, then quickly avert her eyes when she caught his gaze. The man, for his part, seemed content to skim his newspaper, his eyes flickering over the girl with an intensity that was unsettling. It wasn't protective. It was something else entirely. Something Michael couldn't quite put into words but felt deep in his gut. Then it happened. The girl raised her hand, palm outward, her fingers spread wide in a deliberate motion. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Michael caught it. The gesture was too intentional to be random, and it sent a jolt of recognition through him. During his service, he had learned to read nonverbal cues, subtle signals that could mean the difference between life and death. This gesture was one he had seen before, a silent plea for help. Michael's heart rate quickened. He knew he couldn't ignore what he'd just witnessed, but he also couldn't act impulsively. He needed to gather more information to ensure he wasn't misinterpreting the situation. Years of training had taught him the importance of calculated action. He finished his coffee and walked toward the counter, pretending to examine the display of snacks. Out of the corner of his eye, he watched the girl. She didn't look directly at him again, but her body language remained stiff. Her small frame coiled like a spring ready to snap. The man continued to glance at her over his newspaper, his expression unreadable but far from benign. Michael felt the weight of a decision pressing down on him. Should he intervene? Should he confront the man? Or was he reading too much into an innocuous scene, letting his paranoia get the better of him? The line between caution and overreaction blurred in his mind. As he wrestled with these thoughts, the girl's hand rose again, the same gesture, this time more pronounced. Her eyes darted toward him briefly, filled with a desperation that tore at his soul. There was no doubt now. This wasn't a coincidence. She was signaling for help. Michael set down his coffee cup, his jaw tightening. The room seemed to shrink around him as his focus zeroed in on the man and the girl. His military training surged to the forefront of his mind, his instincts sharpening like a blade. This was no longer a quiet stop on a lonely stretch of highway. It was a battlefield of a different kind, and Michael knew he couldn't walk away. As he moved toward the pair, his heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. He would do whatever it took to ensure the safety of that little girl in the red dress. Threads of truth. Michael stopped a few feet from the table, his body language casual, but his presence deliberate. He stood tall, his military bearing commanding attention without aggression. The man lowered his newspaper slightly, his pale blue eyes narrowing as he noticed Michael's proximity. The girl froze, her small hands clenching into fists on the tabletop. "Evening," Michael said, his tone friendly but firm, a subtle test to gauge the man's reaction. The man gave a thin smile, folding his newspaper and setting it aside. "Evening," he replied, his voice smooth, almost practiced. "Can I help you with something?" Michael gestured toward the girl, his expression neutral. "Just noticed your little one looks a bit under the weather. Everything all right?" The girl's wide eyes darted between Michael and the man. Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to speak but was too afraid. The man's smile didn't waver, but a flicker of annoyance passed through his eyes. "She's fine," he said quickly, "just tired from a long day of travel. You know how kids can be." Michael nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably. He could see the man was trying to maintain control of the situation, but there was tension in his posture, a stiffness that betrayed his unease. The girl's body remained taut, her small frame practically vibrating with suppressed energy. "She's got a great sense of style," Michael said, nodding toward the girl's red dress. "My niece has one just like it. Mind if I say hi?" The man hesitated, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. "Actually," he began, his voice taking on a clipped edge, "we were just about to leave. Long drive ahead of us." Michael smiled, but his eyes didn't. "Can't blame you for wanting to hit the road, but it's getting late. Lot of accidents happen on these stretches of highway after dark. Maybe better to rest up a bit more." The man's expression hardened, his mask of politeness slipping for a fraction of a second before he forced it back into place. "I appreciate the concern," he said coolly, "but we'll manage." Michael's attention shifted to the girl. Her wide eyes met his briefly, and in that fleeting moment, she made the signal again, hand raised, palm outward, fingers splayed. This time, it was unmistakably deliberate. Michael's decision crystallized. There was no room for doubt now. "Well," Michael said, stepping slightly closer, "I hope you both have a safe trip. Where are you headed?" The man stiffened, clearly irritated by Michael's persistence. "A family visit," he said tersely. "And you?" "Just passing through," Michael replied, his tone light. "Saw this place and thought I'd grab some coffee." The girl's eyes flicked toward the exit, then back to Michael. Her silent plea hung in the air between them like a lifeline. Michael's military training kicked in, his mind racing through possible scenarios. He needed to buy time without alarming the man further. "By the way," Michael said, shifting his stance slightly to keep both the man and the girl in his peripheral vision, "you remind me of someone I served with. Are you former military?" The question threw the man off balance. His brow furrowed, and he shook his head quickly. "No, never served." "Why?" Michael shrugged. "Just had that look about you. Must be mistaken." The man exhaled sharply, clearly eager to end the conversation. "If you'll excuse us." Before he could finish, the diner door swung open, and 2 police officers walked in. The sight of their uniforms sent a palpable ripple of tension through the room. Michael felt a wave of relief. His call to 911 had been quick and discreet, and now the cavalry had arrived. The man's eyes flickered toward the officers, his face tightening. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice sharp, his grip on the girl's wrist tightening. The officers approached with calm authority, their hands resting lightly on their belts. "Good evening," one of them said. "We're conducting a routine check. Mind if we ask a few questions?" The man's jaw clenched. "I don't see why that's necessary," he said, his tone defensive. "We're just having a meal." Michael took a step back, positioning himself near the girl. "Officers, I think you'll find this situation warrants a closer look," he said evenly, his voice steady but pointed. The girl looked up at Michael again, her eyes brimming with a mixture of fear and hope. The officers noticed her expression and exchanged a glance. "What's your name, sweetheart?" one of the officers asked gently, kneeling to her level. The girl hesitated, glancing nervously at the man. He tightened his grip on her wrist, his knuckles turning white. "She doesn't need to answer that," the man snapped. "She's my daughter, and we're leaving." The officer straightened, his expression hardening. "Sir, I need you to release her arm." The man hesitated, his eyes darting toward the exit. His body language screamed fight or flight. Michael tensed, ready to intervene if necessary. "Let her go," the officer repeated, his tone firm. The man released the girl abruptly, shoving her toward the booth. "Fine. Talk to her if you want," he said, his voice laced with anger. "We've got nothing to hide." The officers moved quickly, one staying with the man while the other crouched beside the girl. "You're safe now," he said softly. "Can you tell me your name?" The girl looked up at him, her lips trembling. "Zoe," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And who is this man to you, Zoe?" the officer asked. Her gaze shifted to the man, then back to the officer. Her small hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the table. "He's not my dad," she said in a shaky voice. "He said he was taking me to my mom, but I don't think that's true." The officer's expression darkened. He stood and nodded to his partner. "Sir, you're coming with us." The man's protest was immediate and loud. "This is ridiculous. She's lying. I have every right to be with her." Michael watched as the officers escorted the man out of the diner, his shouting muffled as the door closed behind him. Zoe sat motionless in the booth, her small frame trembling. Michael knelt beside her, his voice gentle. "You're safe now, Zoe. No one's going to hurt you." Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "I was so scared." Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're brave, Zoe. You did exactly what you needed to do. The officers will take care of everything now." As the adrenaline began to fade, Michael felt the weight of the situation settle over him. This quiet rest stop had been the stage for something sinister, but thanks to Zoe's courage and his instincts, the danger had been averted. Still, questions lingered in his mind. Who was the man? What had been his plan? And most importantly, where was Zoe's real family? The answers would come in time, Michael knew, but for now, his focus was on ensuring Zoe felt safe. He stayed by her side. As the officers returned, their expressions a mix of relief and determination. The battle might be over, but the war to uncover the truth was just beginning. The truth unfolds. The hum of the fluorescent lights in the Ember Field Rest Stop diner gave way to the chaotic rhythm of the police station. Zoe sat in a small, well-lit room adjacent to the main precinct floor. The space was sparse. 2 chairs, a table, and a soft-looking teddy bear that one of the officers had thoughtfully placed in front of her. Despite its comforting presence, Zoe sat rigid, her small frame dwarfed by the oversized chair. Her hands clutched the edges of the table, her knuckles white from the strain. Outside, through the glass walls of the observation room, Michael stood with 2 officers, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. He had stayed with Zoe every step of the way, refusing to leave until her safety was assured. Though he told himself his duty ended at the rest stop, the silent connection he had felt with the little girl refused to let him walk away. "We're running his prints now," said Officer Ramirez, a seasoned officer with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor. "The guy's story doesn't check out. Claims he's her stepfather, but his identification is fake. He panicked the second we started asking about custody documentation." Michael nodded, his jaw tightening. "I knew something was off the moment I saw them together. He had control over her, but not the kind a parent should. It felt wrong." "It was," Ramirez said grimly. "We just have to figure out how wrong." The girl mentioned her mother. "If he's connected to her, that might give us a clearer picture." Michael's gaze shifted back to Zoe, who was now sipping from a small juice box an officer had handed her. Her hands trembled, the straw rattling against the carton. She looked like she was trying to be brave, but her wide eyes betrayed a deep-seated fear. "Have you contacted her family?" Michael asked. Ramirez nodded. "We're working on it. The mother's name isn't in any custody filings, but we found the biological father's name through a quick search. He lives 2 towns over. The man we arrested doesn't appear to have any legal claim to the girl. Best guess, he's been keeping her away from the father for some time." Michael clenched his fists. This could have gone so much worse. "It still might," Ramirez said quietly. "If this guy has connections, or if the mother's involved. We are not just dealing with a custody issue. This could escalate." Michael exhaled sharply, his fingers rubbing the back of his neck. The urge to act, to do something tangible, gnawed at him. But this wasn't a battlefield. The fight here was one of patience and procedure, a different kind of war. The door to the observation room opened, and another officer entered, holding a file. "The fingerprints came back," she said, her tone grave. "Gregory Mathis. He's got a record, a history of domestic violence, and a restraining order filed by Zoe's father 2 years ago. He's not supposed to be anywhere near the girl." Michael's stomach sank. "How did he get her?" "Looks like he picked her up from her daycare earlier today," the officer continued. "The staff didn't question it. He claimed to be her stepfather, and apparently, her mother had vouched for him in the past. By the time the daycare realized something was off, he was already gone." Michael swore under his breath. This could have ended with her halfway across the country, or worse. Ramirez nodded grimly. It almost did. Inside the observation room, Zoe flinched as the door opened, but her fear softened when Michael walked in. She had grown used to his presence in the short time they'd been together, and her small shoulders relaxed slightly at the sight of him. "Hey, Zoe," Michael said, his voice gentle as he crouched to her level. "How are you holding up?" She shrugged, her eyes dropping to the table. "Okay, I guess. I just want to go home." Michael nodded. "I know. We're working on that. The police are calling your dad now. He's on his way." At the mention of her father, Zoe's lips trembled, and she blinked rapidly, trying to hold back tears. "I didn't think I'd see him again," she whispered. "Greg said. He said I'd never see him." Michael felt a surge of anger but forced it down. keeping his voice steady. "That's not going to happen. Your dad's coming, and you're going to be okay." Zoe looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for reassurance. "You promise?" Michael placed a hand over his heart. "I promise." For the first time, a tiny smile broke through her fear. An hour later, the door to the precinct swung open, and a tall man in his late 30s rushed inside. His disheveled appearance and frantic eyes told Michael everything he needed to know. This was Zoe's father. The man spotted her through the glass wall of the observation room and froze, his breath catching in his throat. Michael watched as a mixture of relief and anguish washed over his face. Before anyone could say a word, he pushed past the officers and entered the room. "Daddy!" Zoe cried, leaping from her chair and running into his arms. The man dropped to his knees, wrapping her in a tight embrace, his body trembling with the force of his sobs. "I've got you, baby," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I've got you. No one's ever going to take you away again." Michael stood back, giving them space but keeping a watchful eye. He felt the tension in his chest ease as he watched the reunion, but the anger at what Zoe had endured still simmered beneath the surface. After several minutes, Zoe's father stood, holding her protectively against his chest. He turned to Michael, his eyes red but filled with gratitude. "You saved my daughter," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." Michael shook his head. "I just did what anyone should have done." "No," the man said firmly. "You didn't just see her. You acted. You trusted your gut, and you didn't let her down. That makes you a hero in my book." Michael looked away, uncomfortable with the praise. "The real hero here is Zoe. She was brave enough to ask for help." Zoe tightened her arms around her father's neck, burying her face in his shoulder. "He's my hero too," she murmured, her voice muffled but filled with conviction. Michael felt his throat tighten, but he simply nodded. "I'm glad you're safe, Zoe." As the night deepened, the pieces of the story continued to fall into place. Gregory Mathis had been acting in concert with Zoe's mother, who had lost custody of her daughter months earlier due to neglect and unstable behavior. Together, they had planned to abduct Zoe and flee the country, evading the courts and cutting off her father permanently. Thanks to Michael's intervention, their plan had been thwarted. Mathis now sat in a holding cell, awaiting formal charges, while Zoe's mother was being tracked by authorities. Outside the station, Michael stood with Zoe's father as they prepared to leave. The little girl had finally fallen asleep, cradled in her father's arms. "I owe you more than I can ever repay," the father said quietly, looking down at his daughter with a mixture of love and sorrow. "If you hadn't been there, I don't even want to think about what could have happened." "You don't owe me anything," Michael replied. "Just take care of her. That's all the thanks I need." As the father nodded, his eyes glistening, Michael felt a sense of closure he hadn't experienced in years. The battle was over, and Zoe was safe. But as he watched the father carry his daughter to their car, he knew this was a story that would stay with him forever. A reminder that even in the quietest places, heroism could find its moment. Unraveling shadows. The morning sun spilled over the quiet suburban neighborhood where Zoe and her father, David Harper, lived. The soft hum of birdsong and the distant rumble of passing cars stood in stark contrast to the chaos that had engulfed their lives just hours ago. For Michael Watt, the Marine who had stepped into their lives at a critical moment, the sight of David's modest home was a picture of peace, a fragile one that had nearly been shattered. Michael parked his truck across the street, hesitating for a moment before stepping out. David had invited him over to discuss everything that had happened. Michael suspected there was more to the story than he'd heard at the police station. He wanted to help, but more than that, he needed to ensure that the nightmare that had nearly swallowed Zoe whole wouldn't resurface. The door opened before he could knock. David stood in the doorway, a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude etched into his face. His sharp jawline and kind eyes carried a weariness that only a father fighting for his child could bear. "Michael," David greeted, his voice steady but soft. "Come in. Thank you for coming." Michael stepped inside, the scent of fresh coffee mingling with the faint aroma of lavender, likely from a candle burning in the living room. The house was warm and inviting, the walls adorned with pictures of Zoe at various stages of her childhood, a laughing toddler in a park, a proud kindergartner holding a handmade craft, and most recently, a school portrait with her shy smile peeking through. "How's Zoe doing?" Michael asked as they moved into the living room. David sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "She's holding up better than I expected. She's upstairs resting. After everything she went through, she deserves to sleep without fear." Michael nodded, settling into a chair near the window. David sat across from him, his hands clasped tightly. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the distant ticking of a clock. "You said there was more to this," Michael prompted, breaking the quiet. "Something about Zoe's mother." David exhaled heavily, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, there's a lot you don't know. About her, about Greg, about why all of this happened." He paused, as if gathering his thoughts. "I met Zoe's mother, Elena, about 10 years ago. At first she was vibrant, full of life, and everything seemed perfect. But as the years went on, cracks started to show. She had issues, mood swings, paranoia, and a tendency to manipulate everyone around her. She'd make decisions without thinking about the consequences and lash out when things didn't go her way." Michael listened intently, his hands resting on his knees. He had heard stories like this before, tales of relationships eroded by emotional turmoil. "I tried to help her," David continued, his voice thick with regret. "I wanted to believe she could change, especially for Zoe's sake. But when Zoe was born, things got worse. Elena started disappearing for days at a time, leaving me to care for Zoe alone. I found out she was spending time with people like Greg, dangerous people." "Greg was part of her life even back then?" Michael asked. David nodded. "He was one of her friends, though I use that term loosely. He enabled her worst impulses. I tried to get her away from him, but she always found her way back. Eventually, I had to make a choice. Keep letting Zoe grow up in that chaos, or fight for her safety. I filed for custody when Zoe was 6. Michael leaned forward. "And you won." "Barely," David said with a bitter laugh. "Elena fought tooth and nail. She played the victim, spun lies about me being controlling. But the court saw through it, especially when Greg's history of violence came up. I was granted full custody, and Elena was given supervised visitation. But she didn't take it well." "What happened after that?" "For a while she stayed away," David said. "I thought maybe she'd finally let go, move on with her life. But then, about 6 months ago, she started calling again, leaving messages about wanting to see Zoe. I ignored them at first. She wasn't stable, and I wasn't going to let her back into Zoe's life unless I knew she'd changed." "But she didn't change," Michael guessed. "No," David said, his voice heavy with sadness. "She started showing up at Zoe's school, at her daycare, claiming she had a right to see her daughter. The staff knew the situation, so they never let her take Zoe, but she didn't stop. And then Greg got involved. He's always been her enabler, her partner in crime. When they're together, it's like pouring gasoline on a fire." Michael's mind raced as he pieced the story together. So they planned this. The fake ID, picking her up from daycare. They were going to take her and disappear. "That's exactly what they were going to do," David said grimly. "The police found tickets to Mexico in Greg's car. They were planning to cross the border and vanish." Michael felt a chill run down his spine. The image of Zoe sitting in that diner, her small hand making that desperate gesture for help, flashed through his mind. If he hadn't stopped, if he'd ignored his instincts. "They almost got away with it," Michael said quietly. "If you hadn't noticed something was wrong, they would have," David replied. His voice carried the weight of gratitude, but also a deep fear of how close they had come to losing everything. David rubbed his temples, as if trying to push away the lingering remnants of the nightmare. The court battles, the constant worry, it's taken a toll on Zoe. She's a tough kid, but no child should have to deal with this. Michael's jaw tightened. No, they shouldn't. David leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Michael's. You didn't just save my daughter, Michael. You saved me. I don't know how to repay you for that. Michael shook his head. You don't owe me anything. I did what anyone should have done. Not everyone would have stepped in, David said firmly. Not everyone would have trusted their gut. The sound of soft footsteps interrupted their conversation. Michael turned to see Zoe standing at the bottom of the stairs, clutching the teddy bear she had been given at the station. She looked smaller than he remembered, her red dress swapped for cozy pajamas that hung slightly loose on her frame. Zoe, David said gently, rising from his seat. Are you okay? She nodded, her eyes darting to Michael. Is he staying for breakfast? She asked softly. David looked at Michael, a question in his gaze. Michael smiled. If it's okay with you. Zoe gave a small, shy smile and nodded. For the next hour, Michael sat with them at the kitchen table, sharing a simple breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast. Zoe spoke sparingly, but her quiet giggles at her father's jokes and the way she clung to her teddy bear spoke volumes. The worst was behind her, and she was beginning to feel safe again. As Michael prepared to leave, Zoe surprised him by walking up and hugging his leg. Thank you, she whispered, her voice muffled against his jeans. Michael crouched down to her level, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. You're very brave, Zoe. Don't ever forget that. She nodded, her eyes glistening. You're brave too. Michael ruffled her hair gently, then stood, exchanging a nod with David. Take care of her, he said. I will, David replied. And Michael, don't be a stranger. You're part of our lives now, whether you like it or not. Michael chuckled softly. I think I can live with that. As he stepped out into the crisp morning air, Michael felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He had come back from war searching for meaning, and in the most unexpected way, he had found it. Not on a battlefield, but in the quiet heroism of protecting a little girl who had needed him. The shadows of the past still lingered, but Michael knew he'd helped Zoe and her father face theirs, and in doing so, he had begun to heal his own. Echoes of danger. The following week was calm for David and Zoe. Calm, however, didn't mean easy. Zoe had returned to school, but her once carefree demeanor had been replaced by a lingering wariness. Her eyes darted to the classroom door more often than they focused on her worksheets, and the sound of sudden footsteps in the hallway made her flinch. David worked tirelessly to reassure her, staying home from work to walk her to school and back every day. Michael Watt, the Marine who had intervened and altered the course of their lives, found himself thinking about Zoe more often than he expected. He had returned to his small apartment, intending to resume the quiet solitude he had sought after retiring from the military. But instead of finding peace, he found himself replaying the events at the rest stop, wondering if he had done enough. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was David. Michael, I hate to bother you, David said, his voice taut with tension. But I need to talk to you. Something's come up. Michael's instincts flared immediately. What's wrong? There's been a development, David admitted. Can you come over? Michael didn't hesitate. I'll be there in an hour. When Michael arrived at David's home, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. Zoe's bike leaned against the porch railing, its bright pink frame adorned with streamers. It was the only sign of normalcy in an otherwise tense atmosphere. David opened the door before Michael could knock, his face drawn with worry. He ushered Michael inside and led him to the living room, where Zoe sat curled up on the couch, her arms wrapped around her knees. She looked up when she saw Michael, her expression softening slightly. Hi, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Hey Zoe, Michael replied with a gentle smile. How are you holding up? She shrugged but didn't answer. David gestured for Michael to follow him into the kitchen, away from Zoe's ears. Once they were alone, David leaned against the counter, running a hand through his hair. "She had a nightmare last night," he said. "Woke up screaming about Greg. It took me hours to calm her down." Michael nodded. "That's not surprising. After what she went through, it's going to take time." "That's not all," David said, lowering his voice. "This morning, I found a note slipped under our front door." Michael's stomach tightened. "What kind of note?" David pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to Michael. The words, written in jagged, hurried handwriting, were chilling. "You may have won the battle, but this isn't over. She's mine." Michael's jaw clenched. "Greg." David nodded. "Who else could it be? He's in custody, but he's got people like Elena. If she's still out there." "She is," Michael said grimly. "The police haven't found her yet." David's hands gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles white. "I've already called the police. They're increasing patrols in the neighborhood and told me to install a security system. But, Michael, what if that's not enough? What if she's still in danger?" Michael folded the note carefully and placed it on the counter. His mind raced, calculating risks and strategies. "Have you noticed anyone unusual in the area? Strange cars? New faces?" David shook his head. "No, but I haven't been looking for it, either." "Start now," Michael said firmly. "And I'll help. We're going to make sure you and Zoe are safe." David's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank you. I don't know what I'd do without your help." Michael nodded. "We'll figure this out." That night, Michael drove through the neighborhood, his eyes scanning for anything out of the ordinary. The suburban streets were quiet, lined with neatly trimmed lawns and driveways filled with SUVs and minivans. But Michael knew better than to trust appearances. Danger often hid in plain sight. As he turned a corner, he noticed a black sedan parked a few houses down from David's. Its windows were tinted, and its engine was off. Something about it felt wrong. Too deliberate, too inconspicuous. Michael pulled over a few houses away, his marine instincts kicking in. He exited his truck and approached the sedan cautiously, his boots silent on the pavement. When he was close enough, he noticed a figure inside, slouched low in the driver's seat. The glow of a cell phone screen illuminated the person's face briefly before they quickly extinguished it. Michael knocked on the window. The figure jolted upright, their movements jerky and panicked. A man in his late 30s with unkempt hair and a nervous demeanor rolled down the window slightly. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice defensive. Michael crossed his arms, his posture calm but commanding. "This is a quiet neighborhood. What are you doing here?" The man hesitated, glancing at the ignition as though debating whether to start the car. "Just waiting for a friend." "Who's your friend?" Michael pressed. The man stammered, unable to provide a name. Michael's jaw tightened. "You've got 30 seconds to leave, or I'm calling the police." The man's eyes widened, and he muttered something under his breath before starting the car. Michael watched as the sedan sped off, its taillights disappearing into the night. The next morning, Michael met David at the police station to report the incident and hand over the note. Officer Ramirez was there, his sharp eyes narrowing as he read the message. "We'll run the plate on the car you described," Ramirez said. "But it sounds like they're testing the waters, trying to intimidate you." "Or worse," Michael added. "This wasn't a random threat. They're planning something." Ramirez nodded. "I'll make sure you get increased surveillance in your neighborhood, and I'll keep you updated on any leads." Michael leaned forward, his tone firm. "That's not enough. These people don't operate within the bounds of reason. You need to dig deeper, find Elena, and figure out what they're planning before they make their next move." Ramirez studied him for a moment before nodding. "I'll escalate it. But in the meantime, you need to stay vigilant." The days that followed were tense. Michael stayed close to David and Zoe, helping them set up security cameras and motion detectors around the house. He taught David how to spot surveillance and guided Zoe on how to stay alert without living in constant fear. One evening, as they were installing a camera near the backyard, Zoe tugged at Michael's sleeve. "Will the bad people come back?" she asked, her voice small. Michael crouched to her level, meeting her worried eyes. "They won't get to you, Zoe. I promise. Your dad, and I won't let them." She nodded slowly, but her brow remained furrowed. "What if they do?" Michael placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then we'll be ready." Zoe seemed to take comfort in his words, her small frame relaxing slightly. But Michael knew the truth. They weren't just preparing for a possibility. The enemy was already circling. It was only a matter of time before they struck. And when they did, Michael vowed he would be ready to meet them head-on. The storm breaks. The storm arrived on a moonless night, shrouded in the kind of quiet that preludes chaos. Michael Wyatt sat in the living room of David Harper's house, a silent sentinel as the minutes ticked by. Zoe had long since gone to bed, her small figure curled under a blanket that seemed too big for her. David sat across from Michael, his light bouncing nervously. "Do you think they'll try something tonight?" David asked, his voice low. Michael glanced at the front window, where the security camera's faint red lights blinked steadily. "If they're going to make a move, it'll be under the cover of darkness. But we're ready." The house was as fortified as it could be without looking like a fortress. Cameras lined the perimeter, motion detectors were positioned near entry points, and the doors were reinforced with extra locks. But Michael knew that no amount of security could guarantee safety, not against people who were desperate and dangerous. David's phone buzzed on the coffee table, the sound slicing through the tense silence. He grabbed it quickly, his face draining of color as he read the text. "Outside, you can't hide her forever." David's eyes shot to Michael. "It's them." Michael stood instantly, his calm demeanor masking the adrenaline surging through his veins. He picked up his own phone and dialed Officer Ramirez. "We've got movement," Michael said when Ramirez answered. "Someone just made contact. They're outside." "Stay inside and lock down the house," Ramirez instructed. "We're on our way." Michael hung up and turned to David. "Get Zoe. Keep her in the safest room in the house and stay with her." David hesitated, fear etched across his face, but Michael's commanding tone left no room for argument. "Go, David. Now." David nodded and disappeared down the hallway. Michael moved to the front window, peering out through the narrow gap between the curtains. The street was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the streetlights. At first he saw nothing unusual, but then his eyes landed on a black sedan parked 2 houses down, the same one he had confronted days earlier. His gut tightened. He stepped back from the window and reached for the concealed firearm he had insisted David keep in the house. As he checked the safety and ensured it was loaded, he heard the faint crunch of gravel outside. Someone was moving. Michael positioned himself near the front door, his senses heightened. Every sound was magnified. The ticking clock on the wall, the creak of the floorboards under his feet, the distant rustle of leaves. He had faced countless enemies on foreign soil, but this was different. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight to protect a child's innocence, to shield her from the darkness that threatened to engulf her. A sudden noise came from the backyard, a faint metallic clink, like the sound of a gate being unlatched. Michael moved swiftly but silently, making his way to the kitchen, which overlooked the yard. Through the window, he saw a shadowy figure creeping along the fence line, their movements deliberate and predatory. Michael's grip on the firearm tightened. He could feel the pulse in his fingertips, steady and controlled. Years of training had taught him to think before acting, to assess the situation and choose the right moment to strike. The figure stopped near the back door, their silhouette briefly illuminated by the motion-activated light. A woman, her hair wild and her features gaunt. Elena. Michael felt a surge of anger as he watched her fumble with what looked like a lock-picking tool. She had come for Zoe, her desperation making her reckless. Michael stepped into the shadows near the back door and flipped on the exterior floodlights. The yard was bathed in harsh white light, and Elena froze, her eyes wide like a deer caught in headlights. "Don't move," Michael commanded, his voice low and dangerous. Elena spun to face him, her hands raised in mock surrender. "Relax," she said, her tone sharp and mocking. "I'm just here for my daughter." "She's not yours to take," Michael growled, his weapon trained on her. "She's my child," Elena hissed, her voice trembling with fury. "You don't understand. That man, he's poisoned her against me. I just want to take her somewhere safe." Michael took a step closer, his gaze locked on hers. "Safe? Like running to another country with Greg. You don't care about Zoe. You care about control." Elena's face twisted with rage, and she took a step forward. "You don't know anything about me," she spat. "You're just some wannabe hero sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Michael's voice remained calm, but his tone was steel. "What I know is that you and Greg planned to kidnap her, to rip her away from the only stable person in her life. That ends here." Before Elena could respond, the wail of approaching sirens filled the air. Her defiant expression faltered, and she glanced toward the fence as if considering an escape. "Don't even think about it," Michael warned. Moments later, police officers swarmed the yard, their weapons drawn. Elena was quickly subdued and handcuffed, her protests drowned out by the firm commands of the officers. Michael stepped back, lowering his firearm and letting the tension drain from his body. Officer Ramirez approached, his expression grim. "Good work, Wyatt. We've got her." Michael nodded, his eyes following as Elena was led away. "She's not the only one involved. Greg's still pulling strings, even from behind bars. You need to keep them both locked down." "We will," Ramirez assured him. "But tonight, you stopped her from making it worse. That's no small thing." Michael turned toward the house, where David stood at the back door, holding Zoe protectively. The little girl's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but when she saw Michael, a small flicker of relief crossed her features. "It's over," Michael said as he approached them. "She won't hurt you anymore." David placed a hand on Michael's shoulder, his gratitude clear in his eyes. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything." Michael looked down at Zoe, who clutched her teddy bear tightly. "You're safe now," he said softly. "You've got your dad, and you've got people watching out for you. You're going to be okay." Zoe nodded slowly, her small hand reaching out to grasp his. "You won't leave, will you?" Michael crouched to her level, his voice steady. "I'll always be here if you need me." As the police cleared the scene and the night slowly returned to quiet, Michael knew that while this battle had been won, the fight wasn't entirely over. But for now, Zoe was safe, and that, more than anything, was what mattered. Michael stayed with David and Zoe for the rest of the night, unwilling to leave them alone after the terrifying ordeal. The weight of what had nearly happened pressed heavily on all of them, but the sight of Elena being taken away in handcuffs brought a semblance of relief. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through the living room curtains, the house had grown quiet. Zoe had finally fallen asleep on the couch, clutching her teddy bear, her breathing soft and even. David sat nearby, bleary-eyed but resolute. Michael stood by the window, his watchful gaze scanning the street. "You should get some rest," David said, his voice hoarse. "You've done more than enough." Michael shook his head. "I'll rest when I know you're both safe. There's still too much we don't know." David sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "What happens now?" Michael turned to face him. "Now, the system takes over. Elena and Greg are facing serious charges: attempted abduction, violating custody orders, conspiracy. They won't see the outside of a jail cell for a long time." David nodded, though his expression remained clouded with worry. "And so, how do I help her move past this?" Michael's stern expression softened. "She's a tough kid, David, but she's been through a lot. Give her time, and let her know she's safe. That's the most important thing. David leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. I'll do whatever it takes. She's all that matters. In the weeks that followed, life began to return to normal, or as normal as it could be after what had happened. Zoe started attending therapy, where she began to process the fear and confusion she had felt. The nightmares became less frequent, and her laughter, once tentative and rare, began to ring through the house again. David threw himself into creating a stable environment for her, transforming their home into a sanctuary. He enrolled her in self-defense classes, not to make her fearful of the world, but to empower her. Michael visited regularly, becoming a fixture in their lives. To Zoe, he was more than just the man who had saved her. He was a protector, a friend, and a reminder that there were good people in the world. One sunny Saturday, David invited Michael over for a barbecue. It had been a long time since they'd had a reason to celebrate, but now, with the legal proceedings against Elena and Greg moving swiftly, David felt they could finally take a moment to breathe. The backyard was alive with the scent of grilling burgers and the sound of Zoe giggling as she played with a neighbor's dog. Michael watched her from the patio, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Seeing her so carefree, so full of life, made everything he had done worth it. David joined him, handing him a cold drink. "She's doing better," he said, following Michael's gaze. "I didn't think I'd see her smile like that again." Michael nodded. "She's a strong kid. She gets that from you." David chuckled. "I don't know about that, but I do know I couldn't have done this without you." Michael shook his head. "You're the one who fought for her, David. I just stepped in when I was needed." David's expression grew serious. "You did more than step in. You trusted your instincts when most people would have looked the other way. That's not something I'll ever forget." Michael didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched as Zoe ran across the yard, her laughter carrying on the breeze. After a moment, he said, "I've spent a lot of time wondering if I made a difference during my years of service. But seeing her now, seeing her safe and happy, I know I did something that matters." David clinked his bottle against Michael's. "Here's to that." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Zoe ran up to Michael, her face flushed with excitement. She held out a drawing she had made, the paper slightly crumpled from being carried around all day. Michael took it, smiling as he studied the image. It showed a little girl in a bright red dress holding hands with a tall man in a green jacket. Above them, she had written in blocky, colorful letters, "My hero." "You like it?" Zoe asked shyly. Michael crouched down, meeting her eyes. "I love it. Thank you, Zoe." She grinned, and for the first time, Michael saw not just a survivor, but a child who had reclaimed her joy. As the evening wound down and Michael prepared to leave, Zoe hugged him tightly. "Don't go too far, okay?" she whispered. "I won't," Michael promised, his voice steady. "I'll always be here if you need me." With a final wave, he climbed into his truck and drove away, the sound of Zoe's laughter lingering in his mind like a melody. As he headed down the quiet road, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The battle for Zoe's safety had been won, but more than that, a family had been restored, and hope had been rekindled. And in the end, that was all the victory Michael needed.